Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel and a brand new video. In this week's video, we will be taking a look at how I built this kid's floor bed. This is built from a couple rough sawn poplar beams, and in the video, I'll take you through every step as far as how I built this bed. And with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. So here is a look at the rough sawn beams that I'll be using for this. And these things appeared to not be in the greatest shape, but the inside of the boards were solid, so the first thing that I needed to do was to plane everything down and reveal that good surface. Now normally I would begin the milling process over on the joiner, but because the surfaces of these boards were so nasty, I wanted to first plane them down so I could get a good look at the grain and decide what pieces to cut. Now you might think that just running these through the planer will smooth everything out and square all the beams up, but that unfortunately is not the case because the planer will not take any bow, twist, or warp out of the board. So to get the boards actually squared up to work with, we'll first go over to the joiner, plane one face, then one edge, then head over to the planer, plane the opposite face, and finally we can rip that opposite edge off on the table saw. After doing that process with every single piece of those beams, we are left with a batch of absolutely beautiful poplar boards. I left everything 1 3/4 inches thick, and honestly, looking at those, it was kind of hard to believe that those came from those rough beams, as bad as those beams did look at the beginning of the video. So as far as the assembly or build of this thing goes, basically we need 2 sides, which you can see here, and then the sides will be attached by an upper and bottom rail on the front and the back. These side pieces will be permanently attached to the legs, so in order to attach them, I'm just using dominoes. This is the best way to go about making this, in my opinion. If you're not familiar with the domino, it is a tool that cuts very precise mortises out, and then there are tenons that fit right down in those mortises to connect everything, but also to line all the joints up perfectly. So here's an up-close look at those mortises that are cut out by the domino. And then very simply we can pop the tenons in place in those mortises, which will line those pieces up and connect them together. Now this is just a dry fit for now, just to serve as a demo so you can understand how these pieces go together. And finally, here is a better look at what that side piece will look like. Obviously there will be 2 of these because there are 2 sides to this bed. So the pieces that you just saw me cut were the front and the back rails, and I took the legs back off to show how these would be attached to the legs. Now the tricky thing about these is that these will have to disconnect from the legs. Obviously with this being a full-size bed frame, it can't be moved in a truck bed or SUV or whatever if everything is attached. So I'll be using these detachable tenons, also from Festool, in order to make sure that everything stays together once it's assembled. So the detachable tenons, I believe, are actually called corner connectors, and honestly I could probably do an entire separate video about this. So if you want more information on this and you would like to see a full in-depth detailed video, let me know down in the comments. But basically you cut a mortise on the 2 pieces just like you would if it was a regular mortise, but then you plunge vertically so you can access that other mortise from the top side of one of the rails. So this first piece is popped down inside one of the mortises, then this other piece will act as a fake tenon, and as it's tightened, it'll force the original piece to expand, which snugs it securely in place. So the first piece is pounded down in the mortise without the access point, then these plastic pieces attach to the bolt, turning it into a mortise which will line up with the mortise and that access point. I like to go one full extra turn with the clamp just to make sure that piece is bolted in the original mortise. Then this third piece can be popped into the access point. And then when these pieces are connected and lined up, there's a bolt that can go down in the third piece that's tightened up, and that'll essentially lock everything into place. These are incredibly secure and a great way to make pieces like this that need to come back apart after you have them assembled. Now the spindles in each one of these frames are just 1-inch poplar dowel rods, which would stretch the height of the rails into each one of those rail pieces. So here you can see I'm on the back side of this, marking equal spacing the length down the rail, where I would then cut each of these holes out using a 1-inch spade bit on my drill press. Now if you don't have a drill press, a regular handheld drill will work fine. The drill press just makes it quite a bit easier to make sure the holes aren't angled one way or the other. After I had all the holes cut out, I grabbed my palm router with a roundover bit and just softened the edge of each one of those. Also, this point is a good spot to sand everything down because once you get those spindles in there, you can't really sneak the sander in the gaps. So before cross-cutting the spindles to length, I needed to take the measurement from the top rail to the bottom rail, and then I just cut them to the proper length using my cross-cut sled. Now when I cut the circles in the rail out using that spade bit, I plunged down maybe 3/4 of an inch or so, which would add a total extra 1.5 inches to the spindle length, but rather than cut that to the entire length, I cut the spindles maybe 1/2 inch short. That way there would be a little wiggle room each way, so there would be no risk that the spindles were slightly too long. So after all the spindles are in on the bottom rail or the top rail, depending on how we look at it, we can just pop them in place on the other rail. No need to put too much glue in each of the holes for those spindles because with the rails in place, obviously those spindles can't go anywhere. And then before the glue dries, you want to put the leg pieces on each side just because there is that extra gap for the length of the spindles. If you wait until they dry and they're not set up properly, then that leg piece won't fit. With everything in place, we'll throw some clamps across the joint, and one trick that I like to use is to take a scrap cutoff and put it between the clamp and the piece that you're actually clamping it down to. This will prevent the clamp from digging into that wood surface and leaving a mark or an indentation where that clamp was. The front side of this bed will have a doorway. Obviously, there needs to be some break in the rail in order to get inside of the bed. So the top rail on this part is just shortened up. And then there's an extra frame piece which will serve as a leg on the front side of this bed. This is attached with 2 of the biggest dominoes that Festool makes because this rail will obviously see the most traffic and also be used as a handrail for when the little guy climbs or jumps up in this bed every day. Now again, just like we did on those side pieces that we first glued together, we'll want to make sure that the distance between the rails is the same and that they're consistent with those side pieces. Otherwise, if they're glued up and they're not the same, they'll never fit down in those spots. So before the glue dries, I put the entire frame together to make sure that each of the rails is the same consistent distance with all the other rails, to ensure that this will fit together and there are no accidental surprises when we go to assemble the pieces together later. For the glue up on that front rail, I moved everything inside out of my shop because the floor in my shop is unlevel and it has a drain in it, so I wanted to make sure that everything did set on the same plane when it was gluing up. After everything was dry and the pieces were assembled, I grabbed a palm router with a nice round over bit to soften all the edges, not only because it looks better, but also because you don't want any sharp edges that somebody could accidentally grab onto or bump into, causing a cut or a bruise. And with the bed frame flipped upside down, I needed to attach some internal supports to the bottom rail, which would hold the slats up. And I attached these pieces using dominoes, but honestly, screws would have worked perfectly fine for this. So if you've made it this far in the video at this point, I have a question for you, and I would really appreciate your feedback down in the comments if you're able to do so. But that question that I have for you is, if you are interested in making this bed, if they were available, would you want, and do you think it would be beneficial to have a set of detailed PDF style plans for the build process of this bed? The reason I'm asking is because previously in a lot of my builds I've had people request plans, and I've considered making them along with a website to sell at some point, but so far just haven't committed to going that route. That said, my question would be, if you are considering making this bed, would you want some detailed plans available as well? Or does the video serve as a good enough reference for how to build this bed? Anyway, back to the actual build. So here I'm working on some feet to raise the bottom rail up off of the ground a little bit. And these are just some additional poplar blocks that I had left over from the build earlier, so I'm cutting a little taper off. I actually took quite a bit more taper off than you saw in that shot. But these pieces will be connected together, once again using dominoes to just form some corner feet for the bed frame. And I do admit that I am using the domino quite a bit in this build for almost every joint, but that's the thing about the domino. It can be used for so many different applications, each of those with incredible precision that makes this type of joint extremely easy. And sure enough, these feet will be attached to the frame, again using dominoes, but the thing here is we are only going to permanently attach these to the side frames, and there will be a little overhang on the front and the back frames where those rails will set down in, but they actually won't be attached. That way this thing can come apart like I mentioned earlier. In order to make sure that those mortise and tenons don't run into each other, you can adjust the domino to offset the cut slightly. That way those mortises don't interfere with each other once everything is connected. After the glue is dry, we will once again use the round over bit on all the edges, followed by a little sanding to make sure everything is nice and smooth. And as terrible as sanding is, it is important to sand everything down to get the best looking finish that you can. So here I am cutting some slats out of one of the leftover pieces of that poplar beam I had in the beginning. And while those slats will stretch the width of the bed frame, I wanted to put a center support rail across the length to give those slats some extra support. So I just took some scrap poplar offcuts and made a cleat system that would be connected to the bottom frame of the side pieces. And if what I just said makes absolutely no sense whatsoever in your mind, just stick with me for just a minute and I'll show you how all this goes together here very shortly. Now the center rail that will support those slats obviously needed some feet that would go all the way down to the ground to give it an actual structural support. So I made some more angled cuts and just glued them in place, and then followed them up by putting some screws for extra strength down into the pieces. just because you love to see sanding about as much as I love to sand everything down. Here is one more shot of me hand sanding everything down to make sure that we had a perfectly smooth finish. And then those corner connectors that we looked at earlier in the video can be put in place. So as we mentioned earlier, the first piece is popped down in the mortise. Then this tenon is screwed in place, and as we tighten that first piece will expand in the mortise, locking it into place. The second bracket is then placed into the access mortise, and when those pieces are connected, we'll tighten the bolt that goes on, which tightens the entire system and locks everything into place. And trust me, these are not coming apart after that final bolt is put in. So back to the middle rail support and those slats, you can see that this piece sits right down in the cleats that I bolted onto each side, and then with that middle support in place, we can place all the slats, which will stretch the entire width, but also be supported by that center support piece that we put on. You can see here that I can walk right on top of this with no problem. And I even tested this bed out for a quick nap after all of that hard work, and I must say, it was pretty comfortable. So at this point, all I had left to do was to put the stain on. I'm using Rubio Monocoat Silver Gray. Don't want to spend too much time on that process. And then after the stain was done, here are some final shots before and after I put the stain on. So I was really happy with the end result of this bed. It was a lot of fun to build. I think poplar was an excellent choice, and it's really cool because this thing comes apart too. So if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. I hope you found the content useful. As always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.